Listen closely because what just happened north of the border changes everything, and almost no one in Washington is talking about it. While American media cycles chase the next distraction, Canada has quietly taken a step that challenges decades of economic assumptions in North America. This wasn't a warning shot. It wasn't a speech meant to pressure negotiations. It was a calculated move backed by numbers, infrastructure, and long-term planning. And the implications stretch far beyond Ottawa. In a closed-door cabinet session that quickly sent ripples through global trade circles, Prime Minister Mark Carney confirmed something trade analysts had suspected, but few believed would happen so fast. Canada is no longer organizing its economic future around the United States, not as a threat, not as leverage, as a decision already in motion. The goal is blunt. Within the next decade, Canada intends to double exports that do not go to the U.S., permanently reducing reliance on a single market that has grown increasingly volatile. On this alone would be significant, but here's the part Washington appears to be underestimating. This shift isn't theoretical, it's already happening. In just recent months, as trade tensions escalated and tariffs returned to the conversation, Canada redirected roughly a quarter to nearly a third of exports that would traditionally cross the southern border. Those goods didn't sit in warehouses. They moved toward Europe, across the Pacific, and into markets that were already prepared to receive them. This is not how trade diversification usually looks. Typically, countries talk about expanding options while still waiting for stability to return. Canada didn't wait. It acted, and it acted fast. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand how deeply integrated the US-Canada economic relationship has been. For nearly 30 years, Canada functioned as America's most dependable trade partner. More than three-quarters of Canadian exports flowed into the United States every year. That trade relationship exceeded $1 trillion annually and supported millions of jobs on both sides of the border. Supply chains were built on the assumption that this relationship was unshakable. That assumption collapsed when trade unpredictability replaced trust. Tariffs imposed by the Trump administration didn't just raise costs, they broke confidence. Canadian steel and aluminum were hit with duties that reached as high as 50%. Broader tariffs climbed toward 35% across multiple sectors. Ottawa responded in kind, placing retaliatory tariffs on over $20 billion worth of American imports. Negotiations stalled, then they stopped altogether. At that point, Canada faced a choice: wait for political winds in Washington to change, or remove vulnerability altogether. Carney chose the second option. What followed was described internally as an all-hands diversification strategy. This wasn't symbolic diplomacy. Cabinet ministers were dispatched across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East with explicit mandates to secure new buyers, expand old agreements, and fast-track access to markets that had previously been treated as secondary. Trade offices were reinforced, financing tools were expanded, infrastructure projects that had been delayed for years were suddenly treated as national priorities. The results were immediate and measurable. Exports to the United Kingdom surged by nearly $10 billion in a matter of months. Shipments to the European Union climbed by $5 billion, representing a roughly 20% increase in a short window. Even more striking was the shift in energy flows. Once the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion came online, Canada was no longer locked into selling heavy crude almost exclusively to U.S. refineries. Oil exports to China jumped by an extraordinary 240%. Barrels that once had only one destination suddenly had many. This is the context behind remarks from Canada's trade minister, who stated plainly that the country had become dangerously overexposed to a single market. Between the lines, the message was unmistakable. Canada no longer views the United States as a stable anchor, and global partners are responding accordingly, seeing Canada as a predictable alternative in a world where predictability is in short supply. The tone sharpened further when Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister addressed the broader global shift underway. She spoke openly about a reordering of the world trading system, one moving away from dominance by any single power toward a multipolar structure. This wasn't diplomatic filler, it was a statement of intent. Canada would not wait passively for problems to resolve themselves. It would adapt to the new reality. That statement effectively marked a declaration of economic self-determination. For Washington, the most important part of this message isn't rhetorical, it's structural. For decades, U.S. negotiators operated under a simple belief: Canada had nowhere else to go. Geography, infrastructure, and market size made the United States indispensable. That belief gave Washington leverage. Tariff threats worked because alternatives were limited. That leverage is eroding in real time. Canada is proving that alternatives not only exist, but can be scaled quickly when policy and investment align. Think of it as a power dynamic reset. A partner once constrained by dependence is now demonstrating mobility, flexibility, and the financial capacity to walk away from unfavorable terms. Europe sits at the center of this recalibration. While a comprehensive trade agreement between Canada and the EU has technically existed for years, it was never fully utilized. Only a tiny fraction of Canadian exports went to Europe compared to the overwhelming share bound for the United States. That imbalance is now being corrected aggressively. Recent months show exports to Europe jumping more than 20%. Agricultural goods once caught between tariff disputes found new buyers. Energy shipments increased as U.S. markets became less attractive. Even canola producers, hit hard by earlier trade conflicts with China, demonstrated how quickly supply chains could pivot when incentives changed, sending dramatically higher volumes to European destinations. Canada is also deepening ties through defense and security channels. By committing to NATO defense spending targets at levels not seen in generations, Ottawa is opening doors for its defense and aerospace industries across Europe. Becoming the first non-EU participant in a major European security program wasn't symbolic, it created institutional pathways for long-term industrial cooperation. The message to Washington was subtle but sharp. Partnerships once assumed to be exclusive are no longer so. Then there's Asia. Perhaps the clearest signal of Canada's new posture is its willingness to reset strained relationships with countries it had openly clashed with. Diplomatic tensions with China and India had reached serious levels, involving detained citizens and allegations that cut to the core of sovereignty. Yet Carney scheduled direct engagements with both Beijing and New Delhi anyway. Why? Because trade math doesn't care about old grievances. Canada is making it clear that economic reliability now outweighs ideological alignment. Countries willing to engage on stable terms are welcome partners. Those who inject unpredictability into trade relationships are not. Energy again tells the story. With pipeline access to the Pacific, Canada's oil producers are no longer forced sellers to a single buyer. Asian markets, hungry for reliable supply, are stepping in. Indonesia recently signed a free trade agreement projected to boost Canadian exports by hundreds of millions annually, and early data already shows growth exceeding those forecasts. Singapore has emerged as a strategic hub, with Canadian exports there jumping sharply, driven by both energy and advanced manufacturing. Even the Gulf states are now firmly in Canada's sights. Multiple ministerial visits to the United Arab Emirates highlight a shift away from automatic alignment with U.S. Middle East policy. Instead, Canada is pursuing deals based on commercial opportunity. Energy technology, mining equipment, agriculture, and large-scale infrastructure. This isn't a temporary experiment. It's being locked in with money. Billions are being poured into ports, pipelines, shipping capacity, and export financing programs. Government-backed funds are helping businesses enter new markets. Diplomatic missions are no longer occasional, they're continuous. These investments are designed to function regardless of who occupies the White House or what tariff regime comes next. That's the part Washington seems slow to grasp. Canada isn't waiting for relations to improve, it's building an economy that no longer requires them to. Carney has been explicit about this politically as well. He has downplayed the likelihood of a near-term trade deal, making it clear Canada will not sign agreements that compromise its interests simply to restore the status quo. When comments from Washington suggested Canada could be treated as a tariff target rather than a negotiating partner, Ottawa didn't react with urgency. It reacted with indifference and then continued expanding elsewhere. That indifference is the signal. And it brings us to the consequences already unfolding south of the border, because this shift does not occur in isolation. For decades, U.S. policy relied on the belief that Canada needed access to American markets more than America needed Canadian supply. As Canada diverts 25 to 30% of exports elsewhere, that calculation begins to fail. If that figure climbs toward 40 or 50%, which current trajectories suggest is possible, American leverage in North American trade negotiations weakens dramatically. Tariff threats lose effectiveness when the target has alternatives. In fact, they can backfire, accelerating the very diversification that removes leverage altogether. American industries are beginning to feel this. The energy sector is particularly exposed. The United States relies on Canada for nearly two-thirds of its crude oil imports. Refineries across the Midwest and Gulf Coast are specifically configured to process Canadian heavy crude. As Canadian producers send increasing volumes to Asia, those refineries face tighter supply and higher costs. Manufacturing faces similar risks. Integrated supply chains in automotive, aerospace, and advanced manufacturing depend on predictable cross-border flows. When access can no longer be assumed, companies are forced to redesign logistics, absorb higher costs, or relocate production entirely. Agriculture tells the same story. Canada supplies tens of billions of dollars in food products to the U.S. every year. As Canadian farmers secure buyers in Europe and Asia, American processors and consumers face higher prices and reduced flexibility. And this isn't limited to goods. Tourism is already reflecting the strain. Canadians historically made up more than a quarter of all foreign visitors to the United States, contributing over $20 billion annually to the U.S. economy. That flow is slowing sharply. Border crossings by car have dropped nearly 20%. Air travel from Canada to the U.S. has fallen more than 20% as well, marking months of continuous decline. Industry forecasts now point to billions in lost tourism spending, with Canadian travelers choosing alternatives as trade tensions fuel broader consumer boycotts. Border towns, hotels, restaurants, and retailers are feeling the impact immediately. This is not retaliation in the traditional sense. It's relocation. And beyond economics, there is a geopolitical layer that cannot be ignored. For generations, American foreign policy assumed near total alignment with Canada on global issues. That alignment was built in part on economic dependence. As Canada broadens its trade relationships, especially with countries Washington views competitively, maintaining that alignment becomes more complex. Economic ties shape political incentives. When Canada deepens trade with China, India, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, its calculus shifts. U.S. leadership in North America, once taken for granted, now has conditions attached. Perhaps the most far-reaching implication is what other countries are learning from this moment. Canada is demonstrating that dependence on the U.S. market is a strategic vulnerability, not a guarantee of stability. Other nations, Mexico included, are watching closely. If Canada succeeds in maintaining growth while reducing exposure, the model will spread. That's the quiet message being sent not just to Washington, but to the world. And trade experts are blunt about it. Analysts note that Canada isn't threatening to diversify. It has already done so at scale. Reports from major institutions confirm that a significant share of exports has already been redirected, cushioning the economic blow from tariffs faster than expected. While Canada does face short-term pain, the long-term structure is becoming more resilient. Meanwhile, disruptions on the U.S. side compound over time, particularly in sectors slow to adapt. Political researchers describe this as a philosophical shift in Ottawa. For decades, preserving the relationship with Washington was treated as the overriding priority, even at the cost of compromise. That framework no longer applies. In the near term, expect continued turbulence, more trade missions, more agreements, less urgency from Ottawa to resolve disputes on Washington's terms. The upcoming USMCA review was supposed to stabilize relations, but under current conditions, it may deepen the divide instead. Over the next year, the stakes rise further. If Canada finalizes additional deals and cements new infrastructure capacity, the shift becomes irreversible. Even if tariffs eventually fall and rhetoric cools, exporters will not abandon profitable markets they fought to build. The economic map is being redrawn quietly but permanently. And the core reality is this: American dominance in North American trade depended on Canadian dependence. As that dependence fades, so does the leverage that came with it. That erosion of leverage is already showing up in places policymakers rarely watch closely until it's too late. Pricing power, contract terms, delivery timelines, even dispute resolution clauses are quietly shifting as Canadian exporters renegotiate relationships with buyers who are not based in the United States. These are the unglamorous mechanics of trade, but they are where power actually lives. When exporters have multiple destinations, buyers lose the ability to dictate conditions. And for the first time in generations, that dynamic is working against Washington. What makes this moment especially dangerous for American interests is how little drama accompanies it. There are no emergency summits, no fiery speeches, no public ultimatums. Canadian officials are not threatening retaliation anymore because they no longer need to. They are behaving like a country that has accepted volatility as the new baseline and chosen insulation over confrontation. That posture is far harder to counter than open defiance. Inside Ottawa, officials increasingly frame the last several decades as a cautionary tale rather than a golden era. The integration with the U.S. economy delivered growth and stability for years, but it also concentrated risk in a way that only became visible once trade policy turned unpredictable. From their perspective, diversification is not punishment or protest, it is insurance. That mindset explains why Canada's approach has remained consistent even as political noise rises and falls in Washington. When tariffs were first announced, many observers expected Ottawa to stall, negotiate, and wait out the storm. Instead, the response was structural. Investment approvals accelerated. Export credit agencies expanded coverage. Trade commissioners were given broader mandates and faster timelines. The machinery of diversification was switched on and never switched off. One of the most underestimated consequences of this shift is how it changes private sector behavior. Companies plan around certainty, not promises. When executives see ports expanding on both coasts, pipelines reaching tidewater, and long-term agreements forming across multiple continents, they stop assuming that the U.S. market is the default. Capital allocation follows that logic. New processing facilities, storage terminals, and logistics hubs are being designed with global distribution in mind rather than continental dependence. This is especially evident in the energy sector. For decades, Canadian oil producers were effectively captive suppliers. Heavy crude flowed south because there was nowhere else for it to go at scale. That reality shaped everything from pricing discounts to investment decisions. Once export capacity to the Pacific became operational, the entire equation changed. Asian buyers, accustomed to geopolitical risk in energy markets, value stability and reliability. Canadian supply fits that need, and they are willing to pay for it. From the American side, this creates a slow-burning vulnerability. Refineries that invested billions to handle Canadian crude did so under the assumption of permanent access. Those investments cannot be easily repurposed. As alternative buyers absorb increasing volumes, U.S. refiners face a choice between paying more to secure supply or operating below capacity. Either option erodes margins and competitiveness. Manufacturing feels a similar pressure, though it manifests differently. Integrated North American supply chains were optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Parts crossing the border multiple times during production made sense when trade was frictionless. When that assumption weakens, companies begin to redesign systems around redundancy rather than speed. That redesign is costly, and once completed, it rarely reverses. Agriculture illustrates the consumer-facing impact most clearly. Canadian producers are learning that European and Asian buyers value long-term contracts and stable pricing frameworks. Those arrangements reduce exposure to sudden tariff shocks. As supply is committed elsewhere, U.S. buyers lose flexibility. That loss shows up at the grocery store, where higher input costs translate into higher prices, often with little explanation beyond market conditions. Tourism adds a human dimension to what otherwise feels abstract. Travel decisions are emotional as much as economic. When political relationships sour, consumer sentiment follows. Canadian travelers choosing Europe, Asia, or domestic destinations over U.S. trips may not think of themselves as making political statements, but the aggregate effect is real. Border economies that once relied on steady Canadian traffic are discovering how quickly assumptions can fail. The ripple effects extend into services, education, and investment flows. Canadian students reconsider U.S. universities. Pension funds diversify real estate holdings away from American markets. None of these shifts make headlines individually, but together they signal a broad recalibration of trust. Geopolitically, the consequences are subtle but significant. Economic alignment has always underpinned diplomatic alignment. When trade flows diversify, so do strategic interests. Canada's renewed engagement with Asian and Middle Eastern partners is not just about exports. It is about influence, standards, and long-term positioning. Countries that trade together write rules together. Over time, that shapes everything from technology norms to security cooperation. Washington's traditional advantage has been its ability to set terms simply by being indispensable. That advantage weakens when indispensability fades. Canada does not need to oppose U.S. leadership explicitly for that leadership to erode. It only needs to make itself less dependent on it. Trade analysts emphasize that this is not a zero-sum outcome in theory. A more diversified Canada could still maintain strong economic ties with the United States. The problem arises when American policy assumes dependence that no longer exists, threats calibrated for a past reality land differently in a new one. Instead of compliance, they trigger acceleration away. Institutions like the Bank of Canada have acknowledged that the transition carries costs. Short-term disruptions, sectoral adjustments, and regional imbalances are real. But they also note that resilience has value, particularly in an era defined by geopolitical uncertainty. From that perspective, diversification is not a retreat from growth, but a redefinition of it. The upcoming review of the USMCA was originally framed as an opportunity to modernize and stabilize the relationship. Under current conditions, it risks becoming a stress test instead. If Washington approaches the process assuming leverage that has already diminished, negotiations could harden positions rather than resolve them. Ottawa, no longer negotiating from fear of exclusion, has less incentive to concede. Leadership personalities matter here, but not as much as structure. Even if political leadership changes in Washington, the infrastructure Canada is building will not disappear. Ports do not shrink. Pipelines do not unbuild themselves. Trade relationships, once mature, persist because they create mutual dependence elsewhere. This is why some observers argue that the most consequential phase is already behind us. The decision to diversify has been made, the capital has been committed, the learning curve has been climbed. What remains is execution and expansion, not reversal. For American policymakers, the uncomfortable truth is that leverage is easiest to lose when you assume it cannot be lost. Geographic proximity no longer guarantees primacy in a world where logistics, finance, and diplomacy are global. Canada's experience is demonstrating that mid-sized economies can reposition themselves faster than traditional models predict when pushed by instability. The lesson extends beyond Canada. Other U.S. trading partners are paying attention. The logic is straightforward. If a country as integrated as Canada can meaningfully reduce exposure to U.S. trade risk, others can as well. That realization alone changes negotiation dynamics everywhere. None of this means the U.S.-Canada relationship is collapsing. Trade volumes remain enormous. Cultural and institutional ties remain deep. But the nature of the relationship is changing from asymmetry toward balance. Balance limits coercion. Balance demands predictability. And predictability is precisely what recent years have undermined. Canada's quiet pivot is not about winning an argument or making a point. It is about removing a vulnerability that no longer made sense in a fragmented global economy. By the time the consequences are fully visible, the window to reverse them will have closed. That is the strategic reality now facing Washington. The leverage it once relied on was not taken away. It was outgrown.